On the morning of January 12th, with the temperature locked at 9 degrees, the fuel dealer told Jason he was cut off. No more credit. No more deliveries. His tractor had 3 gallons in the tank, a blizzard was forecast, and 500 acres of frozen feed needed to be hauled. He was facing the choice between financial ruin and a frozen farm. What he did next, with a 55-gallon drum of golden waste oil, defied every manual and saved everything he owned. Jason Edgerton was 58 years old, running a 300-acre dairy and feed operation in northern Vermont entirely on that tractor. Without it, the cows wouldn't eat, the milk wouldn't get shipped, and the bank would own his land by spring. He was staring at a choice between freezing to death financially or attempting a mechanical gamble every diesel manual warned against. But Jason had a secret, one born from a lesson his grandfather taught him 60 years prior, and it was sitting in 55-gallon drums behind the barn. This is how one man turned fast food waste into liquid survival. Let me tell you about Jason Edgerton, because the reason he even considered pouring fryer grease into a diesel tank goes back to a wood stove in a drafty farmhouse in 1958. Jason was born in 1965, the only son of Robert and Mary Edgerton. Robert ran a 160-acre dairy farm outside St. Johnsbury, Vermont. He operated it with a 1952 Ford A10 tractor and later a 1964 Massey Ferguson 135. Both bought used, both paid for in cash from milk checks. Robert was a pragmatic man in every way except one. He hated debt, not because he was against borrowing, but because he'd seen what interest did to his own father. In 1932, Jason's grandfather, Walter, had taken a loan from the St. Johnsbury Cooperative Bank to buy a new milking machine. The loan was for $300 at 7%. Walter made his payments through the Depression, but in 1938, the bank was acquired by a larger institution in Burlington. The new owners reviewed the books and decided to call in every loan under $500 as an administrative efficiency. Walter's loan was called. He had 30 days. He didn't have $300 in cash. The bank took the milking machine and the 2 Guernsey cows he'd pledged as collateral. Walter spent the next 10 years milking by hand. He never borrowed another cent. Robert heard that story at the kitchen table year after year. The lesson wasn't just about banks. It was about dependency. Depending on a machine you didn't own, depending on fuel you couldn't make, depending on a system that could cut you off with a ledger entry. Robert taught Jason that the only security on a farm was what you could fix, grow, or make yourself, especially the fuel. In the winter of 1958, during a brutal cold snap, Robert couldn't get a heating oil delivery. The roads were impassable, so he did what his father had done in the 20s. He filtered used motor oil through a burlap sack, poured it into a modified potbelly stove, and heated the house. It smoked. It stank. But it kept the pipes from freezing. Jason was just a boy, but he remembered the smell and the lesson. You use what you have. You make it work. Now let me tell you about the tractor, because the machine Jason was about to risk wasn't just a tractor. It was a 1972 International Harvester 566, a diesel indirect injection mechanically governed. It was the tractor his father bought the year Jason turned 7. Robert saved for 6 years to buy it new for $4,200. Cash. No loan. He maintained it like a watch. Every 50 hours the oil changed. Every season the filters replaced. Every winter it was parked in the heated workshop. That tractor planted, harvested, and hauled for 40 years. When Robert handed the farm to Jason in 2000, he pointed at the 566 and said one sentence. This tractor outlasted 3 banks, 2 recessions, and 1 divorce. You take care of it, it'll take care of you. Jason did. He farmed the 300 acres he'd expanded to with that same tractor. Corn, hay, and dairy. He ran the operation the way his father had. Careful costs, money saved after every milk check, but the world around him had changed. Let me tell you about the numbers, because the numbers are what forced Jason's hand. In 2005, diesel fuel in Vermont averaged $2.20 a gallon. By 2010, it was $3.10. By 2015, It was $3.70. Jason's 566 burned about 5 gallons an hour under load. During the winter feeding season, he ran at 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's 280 gallons a week. At $3.70 a gallon, that's $1,036 a week just in tractor fuel. For 2 months of winter feeding, that was over $8,000. And that was just the tractor. The trucks, the generators, the barn heaters all ran on diesel or heating oil. Jason's annual fuel bill topped $30,000. He managed it by pre-buying fuel in the summer when prices were lower, using a line of credit from the St. Johnsbury Agricultural Credit Union. He'd buy 10,000 gallons at a time, lock in a price, and pay it off over the fall harvest. It was a system. It worked. Until it didn't. Let me tell you about the credit union, because the institution that cut Jason off wasn't a faceless corporation. It was run by a man named Chuck Dobbs. Chuck was 62 years old. He'd been the loan manager at the credit union for 28 years. He knew every farmer in the county by name, by acreage, by debt load. He'd approved Jason's pre-buy line of credit every year for 15 years. The limit was $25,000. Jason would draw on it in July, repay it by November, perfect history. In 2018, everything shifted. A series of late payments from other larger farms, combined with a directive from the credit union's board to reduce exposure to volatile commodity prices, led Chuck to review every fuel pre-buy line. The board's new policy was simple: no more unsecured fuel loans. Any farmer wanting to pre-buy had to pledge additional collateral, land, equipment, or a second mortgage on the homestead. Chuck made the calls in December. He had a list of 17 names. Jason Edgerton was number 6. Chuck dialed the number. "Jason, it's Chuck Dobbs. I need to talk about your fuel line for next season. The board's changed the policy. We can't extend the unsecured credit anymore. If you want to pre-buy for next summer, you'll need to put up your baler and the manure spreader as additional collateral." Jason was silent for a moment. "Chuck, I've paid that line on time every year for 15 years. I know, Jason, I know. It's not about you. It's about the portfolio. The board says the risk is too concentrated. We need more security. My baler and spreader are what I need to make the money to pay you back. If I pledge them and then have a bad year, you take my equipment and I can't farm at all. It's the only option the board will approve. I'm sorry." Jason hung up the phone. He didn't have $25,000 in cash to pre-buy fuel. He couldn't pledge his essential equipment. He was facing the coming year with no fuel security. But he had the 10,000 gallons he'd bought last summer still in his tank. He'd make it through the next season, then figure something out. That was the plan. Then winter came early. Let me tell you about the winter of 2018, because it wasn't just cold. It was historically cold. November temperatures dropped to 10 below zero and stayed there. December brought 3 major blizzards back-to-back. Jason's fuel consumption for heating and feeding doubled. By Christmas, his 10,000-gallon tank was down to 4,000. By the first week of January, it was at 1,500. He called his fuel dealer, a regional company called Green Mountain Fuels. He needed a delivery, 2,000 gallons on credit against the fall harvest. He'd done it before in tight years. The dispatcher put him on hold, then came back. "Mr. Edgerton, I've been instructed to inform you that we cannot extend any further credit to your account. Your current balance must be paid in full before any new deliveries." Jason's current balance was $800 from a small top-up in November. He could pay it, but he couldn't pay cash for 2,000 gallons. What's the total for a 2,000-gallon delivery at current price? At $3.85 a gallon, that's $7,700 plus delivery. We require payment upon delivery unless you have an approved credit line. "I don't have a credit line with you anymore." "Then it's cash on delivery." Jason hung up. He had $700 in his checking account. The milk check wasn't due for another 12 days. The temperature was 9 degrees. The tractor had 3 gallons in its tank. He had 120 dairy cows that needed 1,200 pounds of hay hauled to them daily across frozen ground. He had a wife, Ellen, who was looking at him across the kitchen table, her face pale. What did they say? They said no. No credit, cash on delivery. Ellen didn't speak. She just looked out the window at the tractor sitting in the yard, its red paint stark against the white snow. The silence in the kitchen was the sound of a calculation every farmer dreads. How long can we last? Jason stood up, put on his coat, and walked out to the barn. Not the equipment barn. The old barn, the one his grandfather built. The one where they stored things that might be useful someday. He pushed open the heavy door. The air was cold and still, smelling of dust and old hay. And there, lined against the far wall, were 7 55-gallon drums. They were white plastic with black lids. They had been there for 4 years. They were full of waste vegetable oil. Let me tell you about the oil, because this is where the story splits in two. In 2014, Jason's friend, who ran a diner in Lyndonville, asked him for a favor. The company that usually collected his used fryer oil had gone out of business. He had 3 full drums in the back, and the health inspector was coming. Could Jason take them, just dump them somewhere? Jason, remembering his father's potbelly stove, said he'd take them. He brought the drums home, rolled them into the old barn, and forgot about them. A year later, the same friend called again. He had 4 more drums. Jason took those too. He never had a plan for them. They were just a favor for a friend, a potential mess he'd deal with later. Now, standing in the cold barn, looking at those 7 drums, each containing 55 gallons of waste oil, he did the math. 385 gallons total, if it could work, if it wouldn't destroy the tractor, if he could figure out how to make thick, cold, dirty French fry grease flow through a fuel injector. He walked back to the house, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened his laptop. He typed 3 words into the search bar: waste vegetable oil tractor. What he found was a subculture, a world of forums, YouTube videos, and PDF manuals from the early 2000s. People had done this. They'd converted old diesel Mercedes pickup trucks and, yes, tractors. The principles were universal. The oil had to be filtered. It had to be heated. And you needed a 2-tank system, one for diesel to start and stop the engine, and one for hot vegetable oil to run it. The 566, with its simple indirect injection system, was supposedly a good candidate. But every thread, every video ended with the same warning: do this wrong and you'll gum up your injectors, score your cylinders, and destroy your engine. An engine that was no longer made. An engine that was the heart of his farm. Jason looked out at the tractor again. He had 3 gallons of diesel left. He had 385 gallons of unknown greasy potential. And he had a choice. Risk everything on a 50-year-old engine, or watch everything stop in less than 8 hours. He made his decision. He would try to filter the oil, just to see. He went back to the barn, found a hand pump, and a roll of 5-micron filter cloth left over from changing his hydraulic fluid. He wrestled a drum into the workshop, where a space heater could take the edge off the cold. The oil inside was the color of old honey, cloudy with cold, and when he broke the seal, the smell of stale fries and burned fat filled the room. He pumped a gallon into a clean bucket. It flowed like cold molasses. He poured it through the filter cloth suspended over another bucket. It took 5 minutes for that 1 gallon to drip through. What came out was clearer but still viscous. He held a match to a spoonful. It sputtered, then caught, burning with a steady, sooty flame. It would burn. The question was, would it burn in an engine at 9 degrees Fahrenheit? Jason took that filtered gallon, poured it into a metal can, and placed it on the wood stove in his workshop. He heated it until it was almost smoking, then took it outside. He poured it into the tractor's fuel tank, right on top of the 3 gallons of diesel. He climbed into the seat, said a prayer his grandfather might have heard, and turned the key. The engine cranked, slow and labored in the cold, then caught with a cloud of black smoke that smelled unmistakably of French fries. It ran, rough, uneven, but it ran. Jason let it idle for 5 minutes, watching the exhaust clear from black to a thin gray haze. He engaged the power takeoff to run the hydraulic pump for the loader. It groaned but worked. He drove it 50 feet forward, then 50 feet back. The engine didn't stall. It didn't seize. It puttered along, sounding different, a deeper, throatier rumble, but it produced power. He had just run his tractor on a gallon of filtered, heated waste oil mixed with 3 gallons of diesel. It was a proof of concept, but it was a desperate one. He couldn't heat every gallon on his wood stove. He couldn't hand filter 385 gallons through a cloth while his cows waited for feed. He needed a system, and he had 8 hours of daylight left. Let me tell you about the first 48 hours, because that's when Jason learned the difference between something that works once and something that works every time. He spent the rest of that first day building a filtering rig. He used a 200-gallon plastic water tank he had in storage, a 12-volt transfer pump from an old RV, a water heater element, and every filter he could scavenge, a coarse sediment filter, a 10-micron fuel filter, and finally a 2-micron absolute filter meant for a home heating system. He mounted the heater element inside the tank and wired it to a thermostat and a heavy-duty extension cord. The idea was to heat the entire drum of oil to 140 degrees to thin it, then pump it through the filter stack into a clean container. It was Rube Goldberg meets farm ingenuity. It took him until midnight to assemble. At 2 a.m., with the temperature at 0, he plugged in the heater, submerged in the first 55-gallon drum of cold oil. The thermostat clicked. Nothing happened for an hour. Then slowly the oil began to warm. By 4 a.m., it was at 100 degrees. It was still too viscous to pump. He waited. At 6 a.m., with the sky still dark, the oil reached 140 degrees. He switched on the transfer pump. It strained, whined, but moved the oil. It took an hour to push all 55 gallons through the 3-stage filter stack. What came out was a clear, golden liquid, the color of apple cider. It was warm to the touch and flowed easily. He had 55 gallons of filtered waste vegetable oil. He also had a new problem. It was still going to turn back into a solid in the cold. He couldn't pour this into his tractor's main tank. It would congeal in the lines and filters before the engine was warm enough to use it. He needed the two-tank system the forums talked about. Now let me tell you about the two-tank system, because this is where mechanical necessity collided with zero budget. A proper conversion kit with heat exchangers, solenoid valves, and a separate tank cost over $2,000 and took weeks to ship. Jason had maybe 2 days before he ran out of diesel completely, so he improvised. In his scrap pile, he found an old 20-gallon boat fuel tank made of aluminum. He cleaned it out. That would be his start-and-stop tank, filled with his remaining diesel. For the main waste oil tank, he used another 55-gallon drum. He mounted the boat tank on the tractor's right fender, with a line running directly to the fuel pump. Then he plumbed the main drum, mounted on a trailer he could pull behind the tractor. Through a series of copper tubes he coiled around the tractor's exhaust manifold. The idea was crude but elegant. As the tractor ran on diesel from the small tank, the hot exhaust would heat the copper coils, which would heat the waste oil flowing through them on its way to the engine. Once the oil was hot and the engine was at operating temperature, he would switch a manual valve from the diesel tank to the waste oil tank. To stop, he'd switch back to diesel for the last few minutes to flush the lines with clean fuel, preventing clogs. It was entirely manual. No electronics. No sensors. If he timed it wrong, he'd gum up the injectors. If the oil wasn't hot enough, the engine would stall. It was a ballet with a 5-ton partner. On the morning of January 13th, with 1 gallon of diesel left in his start tank, Jason tried the full system. He started the tractor on diesel. It coughed to life. He let it idle for 15 minutes, watching the temperature gauge climb. He touched the copper coil on the exhaust. It was warm. He opened the valve from the waste oil drum. He waited. 30 seconds, a minute. Then he switched the manual fuel selector valve from diesel to waste oil. The engine RPM dropped. It sputtered. A huge plume of white, greasy smoke billowed from the stack. Jason's heart stopped. Then the RPM steadied. The smoke cleared. The engine settled into a steady rhythm, different from diesel but strong. It was running on pure, filtered, heated waste vegetable oil. He drove it to the hay barn, loaded the bucket, and drove out to the pasture. The tractor performed exactly as it did on diesel. At the end of the 2-hour feeding run, he switched back to diesel for the 5-minute trip back to the barn. He shut it off. He waited 10 minutes, then cracked the fuel line at an injector. Clean diesel came out. The lines were clear. He had done it. He had a working system. but he had also used 20 gallons of his precious filtered oil. At that rate, his 385 gallons would last less than 3 weeks, and Winter had 2 months to go. Let me tell you about the new math, because desperation is a powerful teacher. Jason calculated his actual consumption. The tractor used about 5 gallons of waste oil per 8-hour day, slightly more than diesel because the oil had less energy density. He needed roughly 35 gallons a week. He had 385 gallons in the barn. That was 11 weeks of fuel. It was enough, in theory, to get him to mid-March. But that was if nothing broke, if the filtering held up, and if he could keep the oil from freezing solid in the drum on the trailer. The cold was his enemy. Even heated, the oil in the main drum would cool overnight. He needed a way to keep it warm when the tractor was off. His solution was another heater element, this one battery-powered, hooked to a deep-cycle marine battery he kept on a trickle charger. It was another jury rig, another point of failure. But it worked well enough to keep the oil from solidifying. For 4 days, the system held. Jason fed his cows, cleared snow, and maintained the rhythm of the farm. He told no one, not even Ellen, the full details. She saw the strange setup, smelled the unusual exhaust, but trusted him. The silence between them was no longer panic. It was focused tension. Then on the 5th day, the engine died. It was 20 degrees below zero with wind chill. Jason had been running for 3 hours on waste oil. The tractor was halfway across the back pasture when it suddenly lost power, shuddered, and quit. No warning, no strange noises, just silence replaced by the howl of the wind. He tried to restart it on diesel. It cranked but wouldn't catch. He was a mile from the barn in a blizzard with a dead tractor. This was the disaster every forum post had warned about. Let me tell you about the walk back, because that mile in a blizzard, knowing your only engine might be destroyed, changes a man. Jason trudged through foot-deep snow, his mind racing through the possibilities. Gelled fuel line, clogged filter, water in the oil, a failed injector pump. Each possibility meant expensive, time-consuming repairs he couldn't afford. Each meant the cows wouldn't be fed that night. He got back to the workshop, frozen and defeated. He grabbed his tools, a headlamp and a propane torch, hitched a sled to his ancient snowmobile and drove back out to the tractor. The first step was to see if fuel was getting to the engine. He disconnected the line from the final filter to the injector pump. He cracked the bleed valve. Nothing came out. The line was blocked. He traced it back. The problem wasn't at the engine. It was at the drum. The oil in the feed line from the drum to the copper coils had gelled into a solid plug. His trailer-mounted heater had failed. The battery had died. The oil in that section of line exposed to the wind had frozen solid. It wasn't an engine failure. It was a system failure, a failure of his own makeshift design. He took the propane torch and gently warmed the length of copper tubing. After 10 minutes, a plug of semi-solid oil pushed through, followed by a stream of liquid. He reprimed the system, switched to diesel, and after a long crank, the engine started. He let it run on diesel for 30 minutes to charge the dead battery on the trailer, then drove slowly back to the barn. The crisis was averted, but the lesson was brutal. His system was fragile. One weak point, a dead battery, a faulty connection could stop everything. He needed redundancy. He needed a better way. This is where the story pivots, because Jason's problem was no longer just about fuel. It was about trust. Could he trust a system he built from scraps to keep his farm alive? That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table and redesigned the entire setup on a legal pad. He needed a dedicated, insulated fuel tank on the tractor itself, not a trailing drum. He needed an electrical system tied directly to the tractor's alternator. He needed a fuel preheater that used engine coolant, not just exhaust. He was no longer trying to survive a week. He was engineering a permanent solution. The next morning, he drove his pickup truck, still on diesel he couldn't afford, to a junkyard in Lyndonville. He spent $200, nearly his last cash, on parts: a 30-gallon aluminum tank from a scrap truck, a diesel fuel heater core from a semi, a spool of insulated copper tubing, and a high-amperage relay. He worked for 2 straight days, barely stopping to eat or sleep. Ellen brought him coffee and sandwiches, watching silently as he welded, plumbed, and wired. By January 18th, he had a new system. The 30-gallon aluminum tank was mounted behind the tractor's seat, insulated with foam and fiberglass. It was plumbed through the diesel heater core, which was tied into the tractor's coolant system. A 12-volt circulating pump powered by the tractor's battery would move the oil through the heater core and a new, larger fuel filter before it reached the engine. The start tank remained. The switching was still manual, but the heat was automatic, provided by the engine itself. It was still a farm-built contraption, but it was several generations more sophisticated. He filled the new tank with 20 gallons of his filtered oil. He started the tractor on diesel. Once the temperature gauge moved, he engaged the circulating pump. He could feel the oil line warming in his hand. After 20 minutes, he switched to waste oil. The transition was seamless. No smoke, no stumble. The engine didn't notice the difference. He worked the tractor hard for 8 hours, plowing through deep snow. It never faltered. He had achieved reliability. Now let me tell you about the silence that followed, because that's when the real pressure began. For 2 weeks, Jason operated in a bubble of self-sufficiency. The tractor ran, the cows were fed, the milk was shipped. No one from the outside world knew what he was doing, but the outside world was about to intrude. On February 1st, Chuck Dobbs from the credit union called again. Jason let it go to voicemail. The message was polite, concerned. "Jason, Chuck here, just checking in. Heard you didn't take a fuel delivery this month. Everything okay up there? Give me a call." It was a friendly check, and that felt like a probe. The fuel dealer, Green Mountain Fuels, also called. The dispatcher, a woman named Sarah, left a message. "Mr. Edgerton, we notice your tank is reading very low via the remote monitor. We're concerned about your animals in this cold. We can do a cash delivery if you can meet us at the road. Please call." They were monitoring his fuel level remotely. They knew he was almost out. Their concern was genuine, but it was also a business opportunity. A cash delivery at winter prices was pure profit for them. Jason didn't return the calls. His silence was an anomaly. In a small farming community, anomalies get noticed. The first person to notice and to understand was his friend Mike, who ran the diner. Mike stopped by on February 3rd, ostensibly to drop off more waste oil, 4 new drums from his kitchen. He saw the tractor, the new tank mounted behind the seat, the intricate plumbing. He smelled the exhaust. He didn't say anything at first. He helped Jason roll the drums into the barn. Then he pointed at the tractor. "You're running on my old fry oil, aren't you?" Jason nodded. Mike walked over, looked at the setup, and let out a low whistle. "I thought you were just dumping this for me. You're burning it." "I am," Jason said. Mike was quiet for a long time. "Does it work?" "It works." "How much did the conversion cost?" "About $200 in junk parts and every minute of my time for 3 weeks. Mike stared at the tractor, then back at Jason. "You know the biodiesel plant in Rutland pays me for this oil now, right? They just signed a contract with me last month. 60 cents a gallon. This," he said, pointing at the 4 new drums, "is about $130 worth of oil." Jason felt the ground shift under his feet. Free Fuel Source had just developed a market value. His friend had been doing him a favor, giving away a commodity that was now worth money. "I didn't know," Jason said. "It's new," Mike replied. "The plant's scaling up. They want all the waste oil they can get. I'm supposed to be saving these drums for them." The 2 men stood in the cold barn. Jason's entire survival strategy was built on a foundation of free, worthless waste. Now it had a price, it had value, and it had a corporate buyer. Mike finally broke the silence. "Look, you saved my butt with the health inspector. These 4 are yours, but I can't promise the next batch. The plant's truck comes every other Thursday." It was a gentle cutoff. Jason had enough oil to last maybe 5 more weeks. After that, his supply line vanished. He thanked Mike. After his friend left, Jason sat on a drum and calculated again. He was no longer just a farmer trying to get through winter. He was now in competition with a biodiesel plant for his own fuel, and he was losing. He had to find a new source, and he had to find it fast before the rumor of what he was doing spread beyond Mike. Because once it spread, the fuel dealer and the bank would know he didn't need them anymore. And in a small town, that kind of knowledge is dangerous. The biodiesel plant didn't have a name Jason knew, but it had a truck, a contract, and a territory that now included his fuel source. He had 5 weeks of oil left. He needed a new supply chain, and he needed it to be invisible. The next morning, with the tractor parked and running on its last gallon of diesel for the start tank, Jason took his pickup and drove to the nearest town with a main street, Lyndonville. He didn't go to the diner. He went to the places Mike wouldn't have talked about: the Chinese takeout, the pizza shop, the fish and chip stand that was only open in the summer but had a storage shed out back. He introduced himself as a local farmer looking for used cooking oil for a project. He offered to take it off their hands for free in sealed drums with no mess. The first 3 places said the same thing. "We have a contract with Vermont Biofuels. They pick it up every 2 weeks. We can't give it away." Vermont Biofuels, that was the name. Jason looked it up on his phone in the truck. It was a subsidiary of a larger energy consortium based in Boston. They'd recently received a state grant to expand renewable fuel production. They were paying 60 cents a gallon for waste oil, and they were locking up exclusive collection rights with every restaurant they could. Jason's free resource was being industrialized. He drove to the next town over, St. Johnsbury. He tried the same approach. The family-owned burger joint, the sandwich shop. The result was the same: contract with Vermont Biofuels. He spent 3 days driving a 50-mile radius. Out of 17 establishments he visited, 15 were locked up. The 2 that weren't were a tiny donut shop that produced maybe 5 gallons a month and a roadside hot dog stand that burned its oil until it was sludge. It was hopeless. He was competing against a corporation with contracts and a schedule, and he was losing. On the 4th day, driving home in defeat, he passed the regional high school. He saw the large dumpsters behind the cafeteria, and he remembered something. Institutions, schools, hospitals, nursing homes, they had commercial kitchens, they produced waste oil, and they might not be on a biofuel company's radar yet. It was a long shot, but it was his only shot. He went home and called the number for the Lyndonville High School maintenance department. He got the head custodian, a man named Bill. Jason explained he was a local farmer and he was wondering what they did with their used fryer oil from the cafeteria. There was a pause. "We pay a rendering company to haul it away as hazardous waste," Bill said. "Why?" Jason took a breath. "What if I took it off your hands for free, in my own containers, no cost to you?" Another pause. "You want our grease?" "Yes, sir. And you'll take it all. We have about 40 gallons a month." "I'll take it all." "Let me talk to the district superintendent. Call me back tomorrow." Jason hung up. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. He called the hospital next. The dietary services manager told him the same story. They paid for disposal. She was intrigued by the idea of a local farmer using it. She said she'd bring it up in her sustainability meeting. Jason called the county office building, which had a small kitchen for events. He called the senior center. He called the technical college. In every call, he positioned himself not as a competitor to the biofuel plant, but as a local sustainability project, a closed-loop agricultural initiative. He was using a waste product to fuel food production. It was a story people liked. By the end of the week, he had tentative agreements from the high school and the senior center. They would give him their oil, pending approval from their boards. It was a fragile thread, but it was a thread. He calculated. The high school, 40 gallons a month. The senior center, 20. That was 60 gallons. He needed 140 a month to run the tractor through the winter. He was still 80 gallons short. And then the first thread snapped. Bill from the high school called back. "I'm sorry, Jason. The district's legal department said we can't give away a potential liability. If you got sick from handling it or if there was a spill, we'd be sued. We have to use a licensed, insured hauler." Vermont Biofuels is licensed and insured. Jason thanked him and hung up. The hospital called back with the same answer: liability, insurance. The system was designed for corporations, not for farmers with drums in a barn. He was back to zero, and his 5-week clock was ticking. Let me tell you about the visit, because that's when the pressure became physical. On a Thursday morning, a white pickup truck with Green Mountain Fuels on the door pulled into Jason's driveway. A man in a company jacket got out. It was the owner, Dave Green. Dave was in his 50s, a former logger who'd built the fuel delivery business from one truck to a small fleet. He was not a villain. He was a businessman who couldn't understand why a reliable customer had stopped buying. Jason saw him from the kitchen window. He walked outside. "Dave." "Jason, how are you holding up in this cold?" "Managing." Dave nodded, his eyes scanning the yard, lingering on the tractor with its unusual plumbing. "Listen, I got worried when you didn't call back. Sarah said your tank been reading near empty for weeks. That's not like you. I brought a load with me, 2,000 gallons. I can fill you up right now. We can work out the terms." It was an act of charity, or what passed for charity in a business transaction. Dave was offering to front him fuel because he thought Jason was too proud to ask for help. "I appreciate it, Dave, I really do, but I'm okay for fuel right now." Dave looked at him skeptically. "Jason, your remote gauge says you've got about 800 gallons left. That's not enough for 2 weeks, not in this cold. What's going on?" There was no good lie. Jason decided on a half-truth. "I've been conserving. Cutting back where I can, the tractor's running less." Dave's eyes went back to the tractor, to the copper coils, the extra tank. "That's some rig you've got there. What's all that for?" "Just a little project, trying to improve efficiency." Dave was quiet. He was a mechanic before he was a businessman. He knew what he was looking at. He took a step closer. "Jason, are you running that thing on something other than diesel?" The direct question hung in the cold air. Jason didn't answer. Dave's expression shifted from concern to something harder. "You know that's illegal, right? If you're not paying the road tax on that fuel, it's tax evasion. The state comes down hard on that. It's not for the road, it's for the field. Doesn't matter. The fuel tax applies to all diesel-powered equipment on road or off, unless you're using pure vegetable oil, which has an exemption, but that's for registered producers. You collecting waste oil." Jason remained silent. Dave sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Look, I don't care what you do in your own barn, but my business is selling diesel. If you're not buying it, that's one thing. But if the state tax auditor finds out you're running untaxed fuel and they trace it back to me knowing about it and not reporting it, I lose my license. I've got 5 families depending on my business. I can't risk that." He wasn't threatening. He was stating a fact. The system had hooks in everyone. "I understand," Jason said. "I won't put you in that position." Dave looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'm going to have to disable the remote monitor on your tank. I can't have data showing I knew your tank was empty and didn't report a potential problem. For all I know, you switched to electric heat." It was a cover, a way for Dave to protect himself. "Okay," Jason said. Dave walked back to his truck, opened the cab, and pulled out a tablet. He tapped the screen a few times. "Monitor's offline. You're on your own, Jason. Good luck." He got in his truck and drove away. Jason stood in the driveway, watching the taillights disappear. He had just been cut off from his last formal link to the fuel industry. His tank monitor was dead. He was officially off the grid. And Dave now knew, or strongly suspected, what he was doing. That knowledge was a liability. Now let me tell you about the second visit, because it came 24 hours later and it wasn't friendly. A late-model sedan pulled up. A man in a dress coat and leather gloves got out. He carried a clipboard. He introduced himself as Alan Finch from the Vermont Department of Taxes Fuel Compliance Division. He had received an anonymous tip about potential untaxed fuel use at this address. Jason's blood went cold. Dave hadn't reported him, someone else had. A neighbor. Another farmer who'd heard rumors. It didn't matter, the state was here. "Mr. Edgerton, I'd like to see your fuel storage and any equipment you're using," Finch said, his tone professionally neutral. Jason had no choice. He led the man to the main 1,000-gallon diesel tank. Finch checked the gauge, which read 750 gallons. He took a sample from the valve, putting it in a small glass bottle. It was clean, red-dyed off-road diesel. He labeled it. "And do you have any other fuel sources on the property?" Jason hesitated. Lying to a tax official was a felony. "I have some waste vegetable oil I use for an alternative fuel project." Finch's eyebrows went up. "Show me." Jason led him to the old barn, to the remaining drums of filtered oil. Finch took a sample of that too. He looked at the filtering setup, the heater, the pumps. He took notes. Then he asked to see the tractor. Jason brought it out from the equipment shed. Finch examined the two-tank system, the copper coils, the manual valves. He asked questions. "How often do you use it? What's your fuel mix? Do you document your usage?" Jason answered truthfully. He used it daily. He ran on 100% filtered waste oil after warm-up. He kept no formal log. Finch finished his notes, closed his clipboard. Mr. Edgerton, the use of waste vegetable oil as fuel is not illegal. However, the state of Vermont considers any fuel used in a diesel engine to be subject to the diesel fuel tax, unless the user is a registered producer of biodiesel or the fuel is specifically exempt. Waste vegetable oil is not exempt. You owe 34 cents per gallon in fuel tax on every gallon you've burned. Can you estimate how many gallons you've used? Jason did a quick, grim calculation. Roughly 300 gallons so far. About 300 gallons. Finch wrote it down. That's a tax liability of $102, plus potential penalties and interest. More importantly, to continue this operation legally, you need to obtain a fuel user's license, file monthly tax returns, and keep detailed records of your oil collection and usage. You also need to prove the oil is being used as fuel and not disposed of improperly, which requires an environmental permit from the Agency of Natural Resources. He handed Jason a bundle of forms from his briefcase. These are the applications. The fine for noncompliance is up to $10,000 per violation. Jason took the forms. The bureaucracy was a maze and he was standing at the entrance with a flickering flashlight. How long do I have? To get compliant, you should cease operation immediately until your permits are approved. Realistically, the process takes 60 to 90 days. It was February 7th. 60 days was early April. Winter would be over, but if he stopped now, his farm stopped now. What if I keep going while I apply? Finch looked at him with something akin to pity. Then you accrue additional tax liability and risk severe penalties. My advice, switch back to tax diesel, file the paperwork, and if you want to pursue this, do it by the book next season. He got back in his car and left. Jason stood holding the forms, a cold knot in his stomach. He had out-engineered the mechanical problem. He had outmaneuvered the fuel dealer, but he had not accounted for the state. The law was a system he couldn't jury-rig. He went inside and showed the forms to Ellen. She read them, her face tightening. They're going to tax us for using garbage. They're going to tax us for not buying their fuel, Jason corrected. The distinction was everything. The state wasn't against alternative fuel. It was against losing revenue. Every gallon of waste oil he burned was a gallon of diesel they didn't collect 34 cents on. The system defended its income. That night, Jason made a decision. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't, but he would try to navigate the bureaucracy. The next day, he drove to the state office building in Montpelier. He spent 6 hours being sent from one desk to another. Fuel tax, environmental protection, agriculture. Each department gave him more forms, more requirements. He needed a storage permit for the drums, a waste transfer certificate to prove he wasn't just dumping the oil, a fuel user bond. The estimated cost for fees and bonds was over $2,000. Money he didn't have, time he didn't have. He returned home defeated. The system wasn't designed for a one-man operation. It was designed for businesses like Vermont Biofuels, who had lawyers and accountants on staff. He was an anomaly, and the system was rejecting him. He had 1 week of oil left. He had no legal way to get more. He was facing a choice, break the law knowingly or let his farm fail. Then his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered. Jason Edgerton, a woman's voice asked. Yes, my name is Mara Silber. I'm a reporter with the Vermont Daily Chronicle. I heard a rumor about a farmer up in St. Johnsbury who's running his tractor on French fry grease to survive the winter. I'd like to talk to you. Let me tell you about the call because it changed the game entirely. Jason was wary. A reporter could expose him, make his legal problems worse, but something in her tone was different. She wasn't accusatory, she was curious. He agreed to meet, but not at the farm. They met at a coffee shop in town. Mara Silber was in her 30s with sharp eyes and a notebook already open. She explained that she covered energy and agriculture. She'd heard about him through a source in the fuel industry who was concerned about the tax implications. Dave the fuel dealer, Jason thought. But instead of writing an exposé, Mara saw a story. A farmer, cut off by the credit and fuel systems, turning to innovation to save his land. She saw the conflict with the biofuel plant. She saw the bureaucratic hurdle with the state taxes. She saw a microcosm of a bigger issue: energy independence versus systemic control. "What if I wrote a story about this?" she asked. "Not to get you in trouble, but to highlight the absurdity. You're trying to do something sustainable, and you're being penalized for not paying taxes on a waste product." Jason was skeptical. "Won't that just bring more state auditors to my door?" "It might," Mara admitted. "Or it might create public pressure. The state legislature is debating a bill right now to exempt small-scale agricultural use of waste oil from fuel taxes. It's stuck in committee. Your story could be the case study that pushes it forward." Jason had nothing left to lose. He agreed to show her the farm, the tractor, the setup. She took pictures. She interviewed Ellen. She did her homework, calling the tax department and the biofuel plant for comment. The plant gave a standard statement about supporting renewable fuel standards and proper collection channels. The tax department cited the law. 2 days after her visit, Mara called Jason again. Her voice was excited. "I talked to a state senator on the Agriculture Committee. He's interested. He wants to meet you. He thinks he can fast-track an emergency permit for you as a pilot project, waiving the fees and bond. It's a long shot, but are you willing to come to Montpelier and testify?" Jason looked out at his tractor, at the barn, at the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. He had tried to solve this alone in the shadows. It hadn't worked. Now he had to step into the light and fight not just for his fuel, but for the right to use it. He said yes. The meeting was set for 1 week later. In that week, Jason used the last of his filtered oil. He switched back to diesel, buying 10 gallons at a time from a station in town with cash, bleeding his last reserves. The tractor ran, but each gallon felt like a surrender. He prepared his testimony, writing down his numbers, his motivations, the dead ends he'd hit. The night before the hearing, he couldn't sleep. This wasn't just about a tractor anymore. It was about a principle. At dawn, he put on his one good shirt, the same one he'd worn to his father's funeral, and drove to the state capitol. He didn't know it then, but he was walking into a room where the fate of his farm would be decided not by a bank or a fuel dealer, but by a group of politicians who'd never set foot on a tractor. He was about to learn that the most dangerous machine in the world isn't a diesel engine, it's a government committee. And he was the only one who knew how his particular engine worked. The hearing room in the state office building was nothing like Jason expected. It was small, windowless, with a long table on a raised platform and about 20 chairs in rows. Only 6 of them were filled. State Senator Mark Robbins, the chair of the Agriculture and Energy Committee, was there. He was in his 60s with a tired but attentive face. 2 other committee members were present, along with a staffer, the reporter Mara Silber, and a man in a suit Jason didn't recognize. There was no audience, no media. This wasn't a public spectacle, it was a bureaucratic inquiry. Jason was told to sit at a smaller table facing the committee. He placed his folder of documents, fuel logs he'd retroactively created, pictures of his setup, his calculations on the table. His hands were sweating. Senator Robbins began. "Mr. Edgerton, thank you for coming. We've read Ms. Silber's preliminary article. We're here to understand your situation and see if there's a path forward that works for you and complies with state law. Please tell us in your own words what you've done and why." Jason took a breath. He spoke for 10 minutes. He talked about the credit union cutoff, the fuel dealer's refusal, the 3 gallons of diesel, the drums of waste oil. He explained the conversion, the filtering, the 2-tank system. He talked about the tax compliance officer's visit and the impossible stack of forms and fees. He didn't ask for sympathy. He presented facts. He ended with one sentence. "I was trying to keep my farm running using a waste product that otherwise gets thrown away or sold to a corporation. I didn't know I needed a permit to survive." When he finished, the room was quiet. Senator Robbins leaned forward. "You say your tractor is a 1972 International 566 indirect injection." "Yes, sir. And it's still running. Better than ever. I change the fuel filters twice as often, but it runs." Robbins nodded. He turned to the man in the suit. "Mr. Porter from the tax department, you've heard Mr. Edgerton's description. Is his technical assessment correct? Is he subject to the full fuel tax regime?" The man, Porter, cleared his throat. "The law is clear. Any liquid fuel used in a diesel engine is subject to the diesel fuel tax. The fact that it's a waste product is irrelevant to the tax code. The exemption exists only for registered biodiesel producers who undergo a specific refining process, which he is not doing. He is using straight, filtered waste oil. It's taxable. Even though it's a waste product he's getting for free, Robbins asked. Even so, the tax is on the use, not the cost. Robbins turned to his staffer. And the environmental permits? The staffer, a young woman, spoke up. The Agency of Natural Resources requires a storage permit for more than 250 gallons of waste oil on site, which he has. They also require a waste transfer manifest trail to ensure proper disposal. He has no manifests because he's not transferring it, he's using it. He's in a regulatory gray zone. Robbins rubbed his temples. He looked at Jason. Mr. Edgerton, you've done something ingenious. You've also stepped into a spiderweb of regulations that weren't written for someone like you. The tax department is right, technically. The environmental people are right, technically. But the result is that you're being punished for not failing. He paused. I have a proposal. We have a pilot program statute for agricultural innovation. It allows the Commissioner of Agriculture to grant temporary, conditional waivers from certain regulations for the purpose of testing new methods. I think we can slot you into that. A 1-year pilot permit. You would be required to keep detailed records of oil collection, filtering, and usage. You would pay a nominal fuel tax, say 5 cents a gallon instead of 34, as a monitoring fee. And you would agree to 2 inspections by the state to ensure environmental safety. At the end of the year, we evaluate the data. If it's positive, we draft legislation to create a permanent, simplified category for small-scale agricultural waste oil use. How does that sound? Jason felt a surge of hope, but he was cautious. What about the cost, the bonds and fees I can't afford? Waived under the pilot program, Robbins said. What about my current tax liability, the $102? Robbins looked at Porter from the tax department. Porter sighed. For the purposes of the pilot, we could consider that a pre-pilot monitoring cost. Waived. It was a deal, a way out, but then the senator added a condition. There's one more thing. Vermont Biofuels has expressed concerns. They have a representative here today. He gestured to the man Jason didn't recognize. The man stood up. Carl Merton, General Counsel for Vermont Biofuels. Our concern is one of precedent and market fairness. We invest significant capital in collection infrastructure and refining technology to produce a standardized, compliant biofuel. We pay for our oil, we pay our taxes, we follow the regulations. If individual farmers can simply collect and use waste oil without any of those costs, it undermines the regulated market and disincentivizes investment in proper biofuel production. We're not against Mr. Edgerton. We're against an unlevel playing field. Was a reasonable corporate argument. Jason understood it. He was a loophole. Robbins nodded. A valid point. Mr. Edgerton, the pilot would require that your oil source does not interfere with existing commercial contracts. You cannot collect oil from establishments that have a contract with a licensed biofuel producer. You'd be limited to sources that currently pay for disposal. Jason's heart sank again. That was every restaurant he'd contacted. His potential sources were back to zero. But then he remembered the institutions. The schools, the hospitals that paid for disposal as hazardous waste. They didn't have contracts with biofuel companies, they had contracts with rendering companies. That was a different stream. What about institutions that pay for hazardous waste disposal? He asked. Carl Merton frowned. That's not our market. That oil is often contaminated and requires specialized processing. If you can use it, that's not a direct competition with us. Robbins looked between them. Is that acceptable, Mr. Merton? If Mr. Edgerton pilot is restricted to waste oil streams currently destined for hazardous waste disposal, not those under contract for biofuel production, Merton thought for a moment, then nodded. That is acceptable. It protects the commercial market. A compromise. Jason had a path, but it was a narrow one. He would have to find oil in the waste stream nobody else wanted. He agreed to the terms. The meeting ended with handshakes. Senator Robbins promised to have the paperwork to him within 48 hours. Jason walked out of the building into the cold February afternoon. He had won a battle, but the war for fuel was just changing theaters. He now had a legal framework, but he had to find a new, more difficult source of oil. He drove home, his mind already working. Let me tell you about the search, because the second search was harder than the first. With the pilot permit paperwork arriving 2 days later, Jason was legally cleared to operate, but he had 0 gallons of oil. He started calling every institution within a 50-mile radius that might have a commercial kitchen and a hazardous waste contract. County jails, state park concession stands, corporate catering facilities, summer camps that were closed but had stored oil. It was a slog. For every 10 calls, he got one maybe. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, the composting facility for the university. They had a small kitchen for staff, and their waste oil was mixed with compostable liquids, making it useless for biodiesel but potentially filterable for him. They were paying to have it hauled as liquid waste. They agreed to let him take it if he signed a liability waiver. It was about 30 gallons a month. Then he got the county highway department garage. They had a kitchen for crews, and their oil was similarly disposed of. Another 20 gallons a month. Slowly, painfully, he built a patchwork supply chain, a seminary, a museum cafe, a ski lodge's summer storage. None of it was easy. All of it required him to show up with his own containers, pump it himself, and haul it away. But by March 1st, he had secured about 100 gallons a month of supply. It was enough, barely, to finish the winter and build a reserve for the next. The system was legal, but it was relentless work. Now let me tell you about the spring of 2019, because that's when the story leaves Jason's farm and enters the community. Mara Silber's article was published in the Vermont Daily Chronicle a week after the hearing. The headline read, "French Fry Fuel, One Farmer's Fight to Heat His Tractor and His Home." It was balanced, highlighting both Jason's ingenuity and the regulatory tangle. It mentioned the pilot program. The article was picked up by a regional agricultural blog, then by a national farming magazine. Jason started getting calls, not from reporters but from other farmers, first from Vermont, then from New Hampshire, Maine, upstate New York. Men and women in the same position he'd been in, squeezed by fuel costs, facing cutoff, desperate for a way out. They asked for plans. They asked for advice. Jason, who had never wanted to be a teacher, found himself explaining his system over the phone, sending crude diagrams via email. He didn't see himself as a pioneer. He saw himself as a guy who'd been backed into a corner. But to them, he was a roadmap. In April, with the ground thawing, a professor from the University of Vermont's engineering department called. He wanted to bring students to see the setup, to take measurements, to document it as a case study in appropriate technology. Jason agreed. For 2 days, students swarmed over his tractor, taking temperature readings, fuel samples, emission tests. Their preliminary finding was what Jason already knew. The tractor ran fine, emissions were slightly higher in particulates but lower in hydrocarbons, and the engine showed no abnormal wear after 4 months of use. The professor asked if Jason would be willing to speak at a symposium. Jason, who hated public speaking, said he'd think about it. The world was opening up, and it was terrifying. Let me tell you about the conversation with Chuck Dobbs, because it happened in May and it closed a loop. Chuck called, not about credit but as a neighbor. He asked if he could stop by. He came on a Saturday morning bringing a six-pack of beer. They sat on Jason's porch. "I read the article," Chuck said. "I'm the source in the fuel industry, are I?" Jason nodded. "I didn't give your name," Chuck said. "I just told her there was a story. What you did, it impressed me. And it scared me. It showed me that my business is fragile too. If every farmer did what you did, I'd be out of business." "I wasn't trying to put you out of business," Jason said. "I was trying to keep my farm in business." "I know, that's what's scary. The system we built, credit, fuel, delivery, debt, it all depends on you needing us. You found a way not to need us. That's power." Chuck took a sip of his beer. "The board reversed the policy on fuel pre-buy collateral. Too much bad press. We're back to unsecured lines for good customers." It was an apology in banker language. Jason thanked him. They talked about the weather, the price of milk, neutral topics. When Chuck left, he shook Jason's hand. "You know, my grandfather was a farmer," Chuck said. He used to say the only good debt is debt you can walk away from. You walked away. I respect that. It was the end of a conflict, not with a victory, but with a tense, mutual understanding. Now, let me tell you about the end of the pilot year, because the data told the final story. Jason kept meticulous records, as required. He collected 1,240 gallons of waste oil from 7 different institutional sources. He filtered and used 1,180 gallons in his tractor over 12 months. He paid $60 in total fuel tax under the pilot rate. He saved an estimated $4,500 in diesel fuel costs. The state's inspections found no environmental issues. His filtering was more thorough than required. The engine teardown inspection, performed by a neutral mechanic, showed normal wear for a tractor of its age. Carbon buildup was slightly higher, but not detrimental. The injectors were clean. The pilot was declared a success. In February of 2020, Senator Robbins introduced Bill S-224, the Small-Scale Agricultural Fuel Independence Act. It created a new category, on-farm waste fuel. It allowed farmers to collect and use waste vegetable oil from non-commercial streams with a simple annual permit and a fixed, low-tax rate. It passed the Senate unanimously. It passed the House with minor amendments. The governor signed it into law in April. Jason Edgerton was invited to the signing ceremony. He stood in the back, wearing his same flannel shirt, and watched the politicians smile for the cameras. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired and relieved. Let me tell you about the last run of the winter, because it's the quiet part that matters. In March of 2020, with the law passed but not yet in effect, Jason fired up the tractor for the final feeding run of the season. He had 20 gallons of filtered oil in his tank, sourced from the university composting facility. The engine started on diesel, as always. He let it warm up, switched to waste oil, and drove out to the pasture. The sky was gray, but the air held the first hint of thaw. He finished the feeding, switched back to diesel for the return trip, and parked the tractor in the equipment shed. He shut it off and sat there in the silence. He had done it. He had survived 2 winters without the fuel dealer. He had fought the bank, the tax man, the biofuel company, and the state legislature. And he had won a space for himself and others like him. He got out, put his hand on the tractor's hood, still warm from the coolant-heated oil. It was the same gesture his father used to do. The tractor, the farm, the land, they were still his. Not because he was rich or lucky, but because he'd read the mechanical fine print and then written his own. Now let me tell you about what happened next, because the story doesn't end with a law. Of the farmers who called Jason for advice, 7 in Vermont and a dozen in neighboring states built their own waste oil systems. They formed an informal network, sharing sources, troubleshooting problems. They never became a political movement. They became a practical one. The fuel dealer, Green Mountain Fuels, didn't go out of business. They adapted. They started a side service installing and servicing approved biofuel conversion kits for farmers who wanted a turnkey solution. Dave Green, the owner, called it hedging his bets. The credit union restored Jason's line of credit, but he rarely used it. He paid cash for his seed that spring. Vermont Biofuels expanded their commercial contracts but left the institutional waste stream alone. It wasn't worth the fight. Jason's friend Mike, the diner owner, still sold his oil to the plant. He and Jason remained friends. The system accommodated, it didn't collapse. That's how systems survive. And let me tell you about the tractor. The 1972 International 566 is still in the equipment shed. Jason uses it for light work. He's since bought a newer, more efficient tractor for the heavy field work, but he keeps the 566 on waste oil for the winter feeding and odd jobs. He maintains it the way his father did. Every 50 hours, the oil changed. Every season, the filters replaced. The conversion plumbing is now neater, more permanent, but the principle is the same. The tractor that almost died in a blizzard now starts every morning, fueled by the waste of the community it feeds. There's a symmetry there that Jason appreciates. There is one more thing, a detail Jason found years later, after his mother passed away. He was cleaning out her attic and found an old wooden crate with his grandfather Walter's things. Inside, among old receipts and tools, was a manual. It was for a stationary diesel engine from the 1920s. The manual was in German, but there were handwritten notes in the margins in English. One note on a page discussing fuel read, "Tested with peanut oil, corn oil, lard. All work if hot." The engine does not care. Only the market cares, Walter had known. A generation before Rudolf Diesel's original vision was rediscovered by hobbyists, a Vermont farmer had scribbled in a manual that the engine didn't care what you fed it. The market cared, the banks cared, the taxman cared, but the machine, if you understood it, would run on whatever you had. Jason taped that page to the inside of his own tractor's tool cabinet, a reminder that the lesson he learned wasn't new. It had just been forgotten. Let me ask you something, and take your time with this one. What are you dependent on that could be cut off tomorrow? Not just fuel, a supply chain, a credit line, a software subscription, a single source of income. And what waste is around you, literal or figurative, that you've been taught is worthless, but that could become your fuel if you were willing to learn the system and then work around it. Jason Edgerton wasn't an engineer. He was a reader. He read the mechanical system of his tractor until he understood it. Then he read the financial system until he saw its pressure points. Then he read the legal system until he found a pilot program buried in a subcommittee. He used each system's own rules to protect himself from its failures. The fuel dealer cut him off in January. He ran his tractor on waste oil the rest of the winter and every winter after. Not because he hated the system, but because he refused to be its casualty. The difference between surviving and failing wasn't money or luck. It was the willingness to get your hands dirty, to read the fine print, and to pour something golden and unexpected into the tank. The story of Jason Edgerton is not a story about beating the system. It is a story about understanding a system so thoroughly that you can build a smaller, better one inside it. He didn't overthrow the bank, the fuel dealer, or the state. He simply found the space they had forgotten to regulate, and he planted his flag there. That space is what our grandfathers called independence, and what we might call resilience. It's the gap between what you're told you must have and what you can actually use. Every industry, every institution operates on the assumption of your dependency. Break that assumption and you break their power over you. But breaking it requires more than rebellion. It requires literacy. The mechanical literacy to understand an engine, the financial literacy to read a loan agreement, the legal literacy to navigate a permit. Jason became literate in 3 different languages to save his farm. Most of us won't need to convert a tractor. But we will face our own version of the January cutoff: a job loss, a medical bill, a broken supply chain, a changing market. The question is not whether you'll face it, but what you've learned to use that everyone else calls waste. What golden resource is flowing past you unseen because you've been trained to look only at the pump, only at the price, only at the approved solution. Look at your own life. What's in your barn? What's in your grandfather's manual? What clause on what page have you not read? Because the systems that surround us are not monoliths. They are collections of rules, and rules have seams. Find the seam. Read the fine print. Build your own filter. And when the cold comes and the truck drives away, you'll already know what to pour into the tank. Thanks for watching. If you found a seam in the story today, consider subscribing. We find them every week.